Today at the National Press Club, Chair of Universities Australia, Professor John Dewar. The way Australia approaches higher education is at a crossroads, and Mr Dewar is on the forefront of changes, advocating for a policy reset in the sector. John Dewar with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia and today's Westpac address. My name is Julie Hare and I'm a director of the club, and I'm also the education editor at the Australian Financial Review. Today's guest is Professor John Dewar AO, Chairperson of Universities Australia and Vice-Chancellor and President of La Trobe University. John really doesn't need any introduction to anybody in this room, but for those who don't know, he is currently one of Australia's longest serving Vice-Chancellors, but not quite, having picked up the reins at La Trobe in 2012. 10 years later, with his feet well under the desk, that makes him, dare we say it, something of an elder statesman. Sorry, John. John has also been Chairman of Universities Australia last year, and what a year it's been. And he also has such a long list of appointments and directorships and awards and honorary and visiting professorships that if we went through them all, we wouldn't have time for his speech. So, if you are following this conversation online, please find us on Twitter. Our user handle is @PressClubAust, AUST, and our hashtag is NPC. Everyone, please welcome Professor John Dewar.
Thank you very much, Julie. And thank you to the National Press Club for hosting Australia's universities today. I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples on whose country we are meeting and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And this being NAIDOC Week, I want to reaffirm the commitment of every member of Universities Australia to walk together with Indigenous Australians to achieve meaningful change on our campuses and off them. Every year, in the last week of February, hundreds of thousands of young people head off excitedly to Orientation Week at university to begin their journey to adulthood. Others, slightly older, begin university courses to pursue new interests, gain new qualifications, and maybe make a second start in life. But they have one thing in common. People are proud of them. Grandparents, parents, partners, children. You hear it all the time wherever you go. At the next table in the cafe, in the lift at work, at dog walk time in the park. My kids got into engineering. Mine's going to be a nurse. My husband's giving law school a go. My granddaughter's doing a PhD. And for every proud grandparent, parent, partner or child, there's also a relieved employer who can now fill a vacancy in their manufacturing business, hospital department, aged care home or school, filling those advertisements that say, maths teacher wanted. Country town needs GP. Are you a qualified software engineer? Now, Australia's universities aren't perfect. I accept that, and we cop our fair share of criticism, and sometimes fair enough. For example, in recent times, some universities have failed to pay their casual staff properly, something that clearly should not have happened, and which all universities must and will address as a matter of urgency. We can do better. But in recognising and rectifying our mistakes, we mustn't overlook the big positive story and the pride I've just talked about. People are so proud to say that their loved ones have got into university because they know that a university or vocational qualification will help them achieve their potential and will set them up for a fulfilling career with greater job security and higher income. During their own lifetimes, the parents and grandparents of today's undergraduates have seen the old economy, with its millions of secure jobs on assembly lines or supermarket checkouts or typing pools, wiped out and replaced by jobs demanding trade qualifications and degrees, sometimes even postgraduate degrees. So they're not only proud, they're relieved. Employers also appreciate what universities do. They depend on us heavily. Surveys of businesses and employers show time after time that they rate highly what our graduates bring to their workplaces. Not just immediate job-ready skills, but broad conceptual skills as well. And whether their new employees have studied engineering or science or the law or liberal arts, employers value their capacity to think broadly and creatively. And they tell us this all the time. The students and graduates themselves know the value of their qualifications, especially those slightly older ones who may have left school early and know what it's like to be part of the unskilled job market. For my own part, I always love going to the graduation ceremonies we hold at our Mildura campus for our nursing students. Over and over again, our graduates from that campus, mostly women, many the first members of their family to go to university, tell a similar story of how obtaining their nursing qualification allowed them to gain a secure and valued job where they can contribute to society. It's life-changing. And that is what makes me proud to be part of the university world also. And the fact is that the importance of universities is going to increase, especially their economic importance. According to the National Skills Commission, 1 million new jobs are going to be created in Australia over the next 5 years. And more than half of those, 53%, are going to require a bachelor's degree or higher. And more than 9 out of 10 will require some form of post-school qualification. The blunt truth is this: to get a good job in these days in the major areas of jobs growth, like IT, health and STEM, you need a university or a vocational qualification. Full stop. Now, as last week's census demonstrated, universities have participated in a major transformation of our nation in recent times. The millennials, who we now know outnumber the baby boomers, are the most highly educated generation in history. This march of the millennials has made our nation almost unrecognisable from a century ago. When I, and I suspect many of you, were 18, only a very small proportion of people got into university and acquired a university degree. In the late 1960s, it was just 1% of Australia's population. Even by the early 1980s, it was still only about 6%. Most of them men, and often from very similar social backgrounds. But what a different story today. Australia hasn't looked back. Once the preserve of a tiny minority, university is now an expectation for many. Universities are no longer bastions of privilege. They are engines of opportunity. Not elite, but democratic. And again, the numbers are compelling. As of May 2021, 31% of Australians between the ages of 15 and 74 had a bachelor's degree or higher, nearly a third. And that proportion is rising fast, because the younger people are, the more likely they are to obtain a degree. In 2021, 44% of people aged between 25 to 34 had a bachelor's degree or above. For young men who've historically had more options in the trades, that figure was 37%. But the really extraordinary figure is what's happening with young women. Last year, a significant milestone was reached. 50.3%, more than half of all young women aged 25 to 34 now hold a bachelor's degree or higher. And that's an increase from just 26% in 2001. That's almost a doubling in just 20 years. At my own university, it's 65% of our students are women, almost 2/3. So think about what those numbers mean. They mean that a young man is many times more likely to be a graduate or a skilled tradesperson than his father was, and that a young woman is more likely to have a degree than not to have one. Think about that. More likely to have a degree than not have one. University education is becoming the norm. For young women, it's already the norm. A quiet economic and social revolution has occurred, built on the hard work of students and scholars across the country. A quiet revolution made possible by Australia's world-class universities working in partnership with clear policy direction and intent from government. And this has delivered real equity gains as well, with huge rises in the number of Indigenous, low socioeconomic and regional students and people with a disability. And with so many Australians now having a life stake in our universities, the time has come to renew them. People know the importance of our universities and want their government to act to improve them. The reason is almost too obvious to state. Without our universities, our economy would be sunk. Every industry, from mining to health and IT, would struggle to operate, especially now in the middle of a major skills crisis. And in almost every major industry sector, you'll find partnerships with Australia's universities that help keep the pipeline of people and research flowing. But we need more. In our submission to the Productivity Commission's inquiry into productivity earlier this year, we set out the main facts. Our university qualified workforce makes our economy $185 billion, or 8.5% larger than it would otherwise be. Every dollar we invest in teaching, we get $3 back. Every dollar we invest in research, we get $5 back. In fact, if we could lift investment in higher education research and development by just 1%, we could lift productivity and increase the size of Australia's economy by $28 billion over 10 years. And universities themselves support more than 250,000 jobs a year. Before the pandemic, international education brought in $40 billion a year in export income. Now, due to the downturn and border closures, it's $22 billion, but remains our largest services export industry and our 5th largest export industry overall. So, universities' contribution to Australia's prosperity is clear, and it's obvious at the local level. Where there is a university, there is work for locals, and lots of it. Administrators, security staff, cooks, cleaners, baristas, IT technicians, we employ them by the thousands across the country. Along with the local hospital, universities are often the largest employers in town. And the role of universities is particularly obvious in the regions, especially those with economies and communities in transition, in need of new skills and new careers for their community. And this is not to mention the health centres, the sports grounds, the cinemas, the theatres, the music concerts, the public lectures and other facilities and services that universities happily make available to the public. We openly welcome our communities onto our campus because, after all, they own them. And when disasters and crises hit, universities always step up to support the people living around them. During the floods earlier this year, Bond University offered trauma counselling for free by putting their student psychologists in training to work. Southern Cross University's Lismore campus acted as the primary evacuation centre for that region, with more than 1,000 people gathered there at one point. The University of the Sunshine Coast turned its stadium into an evacuation centre for stranded travellers and locals forced out of their homes by the rising waters. And right now, universities are standing ready to help their communities in the current flood crisis. During the COVID-19 pandemic, our health faculties and medical schools provided the expert advisors our governments relied on to keep people safe and turn the tide on infections. Our researchers, working quickly together with researchers from around the world, helped to develop the vaccines we so desperately needed. And right now, with the nation in the grip of major shortages of teachers and health professionals, we're training the vital staff of tomorrow, and we're keen to help even further. To put it simply, Australia's universities can no longer be thought of as somehow set apart from the national community that supports them. We are part of that community. We serve the community. We are part of the national fabric and essential to the nation's economic future. Right around the country, universities are enmeshed in the operations of business, conducting research and developments on future products, processes and systems, new drugs, new drought-resistant seeds and farming techniques, new sustainable power generation technologies, even helping elite sports people to overcome injuries faster. So when your team's ruckman or goal shooter returns early from that Achilles strain, you probably have a university sports science faculty to thank. This is what we do. This is what makes our country what it is, helping Australia punch well above our weight in the worlds of science, business, the arts and sport. Consider the pressing issues of today, such as climate change, national security and inequality. Our universities are right at the forefront of providing the answers. Educating the engineers who will construct the new grid, building goodwill with our Pacific neighbours and enrolling their leaders of tomorrow, building Indigenous opportunity and cultural understanding. Almost every issue that confronts our nation needs university-educated people and university-led research. The role of universities in just about every aspect of national life is immense and urgently needed. So I want to put a simple proposition to you. If we neglect our universities, Australia is in trouble, deep trouble. But if we support them strongly, our nation will survive. We will be more prosperous, more sustainable, more secure, healthier, more equal, and more respected in the world. In short, universities are the best investment that Australia can make. So today, Australia's universities are reaching out a helping hand. We want to be partners in building a better future for our country. After all Australia has been through in the last few years, and after all that Australia's universities have been through, this definitely feels like the right moment for a thorough reset for the country and for the sector. Now is the time for optimism and clear thinking. As Chair of Universities Australia, I believe our purpose is to strive for a thriving, vibrant, and internationally competitive university system that will underpin Australia's social and economic prosperity and create opportunities for all Australians, whether they go to university or not. We cannot have a prosperous and strong community without a strong, competitive university sector. However, there are some policy issues we need to sort out as a matter of priority. The first is additional student places. The National Skills Commission and the 2021 Intergenerational Report are clear on this need. Over the next 5 years, more than 600,000 new jobs will be created that will require a bachelor's degree or higher. One example from the last couple of weeks. Victoria and New South Wales have announced an extra year of free preschool education for every child. That means that each of those states is going to need at least an extra 10,000 preschool teachers to make that a reality. We are waiting to help. The other factor driving the need for more places is simple demographics. The Costello baby boom, created, if you remember, after the then Treasurer asked us to have one for mum, one for dad, and one for the country, has worked. By 2027, there will be 120,000 more young Australians aged 17 to 19 than there are today. So to maintain the supply of graduates at the level Australia needs, we estimate that the number of university places will need to grow by at least a total of 46,000 by 2027. We're delighted that the new Albanese government has committed to an extra 20,000 places in the next few years, but that's a one-off. We need a longer-term solution. Australia's population will continue to grow, and demand and need for higher education will continue to increase. The previous government's Job Ready Graduates package, combined with the 20,000 places announced by the new government, provides some of the growth that Australia will need. Nevertheless, we estimate that even if you only take account of the impact of projected population growth in that 17 to 19 cohort, the university will still be short, the university system will still be short in 2027 by, we estimate, about 19,000 more places. And that's before we even consider that daunting figure of 600,000 new jobs requiring university graduates over the next 5 years. Without these skilled workers, our productivity suffers. When national productivity falls, our living standards also fall. We need to ensure that the supply of university places keeps up. We can't let this new generation of young people down and rob them of their aspirations. So what we have is a surge of young people coming through at the same time as we have an urgent skills crisis. The answer is a no-brainer. Pair them to the skills shortages and potentially we have the problem solved. Australia urgently needs more graduates and more people quickly upskilling through things like micro-credentials, all of which universities can design and provide. So the crunch is on. Whether it's teachers or nurses or many other essential professions and occupations in short supply, universities and vet institutions can help. We know that these issues are high on the new government's agenda, and we will be bringing practical solutions to the forthcoming Jobs Summit. That summit is a significant opportunity to address that big skills crisis in partnership, to design solutions together, to ensure that every Australian has the opportunity to do their best and make their best contribution to the nation. Working together, governments, employers, unions, the community, and higher education and vocational institutions can deliver results for every Australian. A second and absolutely crucial priority for our country is producing the ideas and the products of the future, the jobs and wealth of the future. Australia is lagging, dropping further behind. Leading innovation nations now invest significant proportions of their gross domestic product in research and development. Israel, 5.1%. South Korea, 4.6%. The United States, 3.2%, to name just a few. Across the OECD, the figure is going up. But in Australia, it's going down. Overall research and development spending as a proportion of GDP declined from 2.5% in 2008-9 to 1.79% when the last figures were collected in 2020. So it's not surprising that national productivity has slowed. This investment decline must be turned round as an urgent national priority. COVID-19 laid bare the fragility of our university research funding system. Universities are funding an increasing amount of the nation's research effort. Government and industry hasn't kept pace. This leaves Australia exposed when those funding sources are hit by a global pandemic. And as part of this discussion, we need to ensure that major granting bodies, such as the ARC, the Australian Research Council, is robust and transparent in all it does, with merit and peer review at the heart of its grant selection process. And we need to ensure that we're funding the full range of research, from curiosity-driven basic research that supplies new ideas and new knowledge, right through to research that can be translated for public good or commercialised. Right now, Australia spends $35.9 billion on all types of research, but only $2.83 billion of that on pure basic research. Without that basic research, we're potentially cutting off the supply of new ideas that we can translate into new products, applications and services. That makes us dependent on others to supply us with those ideas. That's not a place where Australia should be. So we stand ready for a mature, informed discussion with the community and government about the best ways to ensure the health of the research system via consistent and sustainable investment. Finally, in the middle of 2020, the Morrison government delivered a very significant package of changes to the way and level at which universities are funded to teach students, the so-called Job Ready Graduates package. Reeling from the impacts of the virus at the time, the community may not have absorbed just how profound this set of changes was. There were some good parts to it, like the restoration of grant indexation. But there were others that are going to be more challenging in their effects. Total funding, total base funding for university teaching was reduced by 6% on average. And the last remaining connection between the research and teaching functions of universities was cut in that funding model. Now, it's too soon to gauge the full impact of job-ready graduates. The package is a big and complicated one, but conditions have changed since it was enacted 2 years ago. And it's likely that changes to the policy framework will be needed to ensure that universities can keep delivering what students and employers and the nation need. So we look forward to the review of job-ready graduates that will take place later this year, and participating in the development of an accord between universities and government, and to working with the new government through that process. So in conclusion, the case for investing in Australian universities is strong indeed. We are the future for young Australians. We are the future for families, the future for jobs, the future for prosperity with equality of opportunity, as well as the necessary foundation for a more secure nation. Universities have transformed our nation and our society, spreading opportunity, making our democracy live up to its promise of greater social equality. And as the proportion of Australians with university qualifications builds year on year, as we move steadily closer to the situation where more Australians are tertiary educated than those who are not, the 19th and 20th century idea that universities are far-off places with high walls, closed off to the average person, will become increasingly impossible to maintain. It's a fiction that's had its day. Universities are already a part of the national fabric, part of average Australians' lives. They're in our regional cities and country towns. They're scattered throughout our suburbs. You can walk into them in office towers on the main city streets. You can log into them from your living room or from your phone. So when we make this plea to you, invest in universities, their teaching and their research, We're not asking you to invest in some abstract, far-off entity. We're asking you to invest in the Australian people, their suburbs, their towns, and their cities. We're asking you to invest in Australia's future. Australia has passed a tipping point. Universities are now mainstream. The Australian people know the worth of their universities to themselves, their families, their communities, and the nation, and they expect the country to support and fund them accordingly. So support our universities so that we can help the Australian people construct a better future. Give us the tools we need, and we will help Australia do the job. Thank you very much.
Professor Dewar, thank you so much for your speech. I know Vice-Chancellors met with the new Minister, Jason Clare, yesterday, and I hope that meeting went quite well. I'm just wondering whether, given 10 years of previous pretty dire relations with the coalition government, that you and the sector might be overly optimistic about what Labor will deliver to the sector, which appears to be, from your speech, more money for teaching and research. However, the government has other massive challenges, including delivering on aged care, on its ambitions around childcare, energy transitions, atomic-powered submarines, climate change, and so on. All the time, you're asking for more. Universities are posting some of the biggest surpluses in history, like historically massive surpluses. Is the government going to listen?
We did have a very good meeting with the Minister yesterday, Julie. And look, we're quite realistic about the constraints that the government faces fiscally, and that's why the case I'm making today is based on return on investment. This country faces some serious challenges around productivity and around skills. And what we're saying is we can help so that when government does decide to make an investment, and we're not deluding ourselves about how quickly that might be able to happen, that we're ready to act and to partner with government to address those challenges. So, and besides which, we're a peak body. We have to make the case for greater investment in what we do. So we're looking forward to working with the Minister. There will be the review of the Job Ready Graduates legislation. That won't happen quickly. Necessarily, it will have to be thorough, considered, but we will play a full part in that. And we're really looking forward to the development of the Accord, because I think that's a model that absolutely exemplifies the kind of relationship we want with government, one in which we help in return for an investment, and the government can see what investment it's going to get.
Okay, thank you. Our first question is from Tim Dodd from The Australian.
Thank you very much, Julie. Professor Dewar, look, what I hear in talking to my family, friends and acquaintances and other people who I contact in the course of my work is an increasing amount of concern about the fact that many young students are not on campus. After COVID, we have a lot of students who've experienced their last years of school at home, and now they go to university and they increasingly are experiencing time at home rather than being at the campus where there's a vibrancy and life, and they meet the friends and the contacts that they keep with them for their whole life. What's driving this trend? Is it a desire for long-term cost savings by universities if there's a shift to online learning? Is it student preference, or is it an expectation of staff that they can now work more at home because that's what they were doing in COVID? Or perhaps it's a pattern that's been established in the pandemic, which is continuing in universities as it is in other industries. But my question is it affecting the quality of education? Is education better or worse if delivered more online? And I understand, of course, that much of it is hybrid, partly online and partly in person. And also, what is being done by universities to return to the campus the life and the vibrancy which was previously there?
Thanks, Tim. There's a lot in that question.
Yes, there is.
And I realise I didn't answer that part of Julie's question that related to surpluses, so can we come back to that?
Oh, I think we will.
Yeah. I'm not sure I accept your premise, Tim, which is that university campuses are dead. They're not. Absolutely not. Some Vice-Chancellors are reporting that their campuses are almost back to normal. So I don't think I accept the premise. Now, it's true that some parts of the country have been worse affected than others. I think in Victoria, where we were locked down the longest, it's probably harder to get staff and students to come back onto campus. But it is absolutely not about cost saving. Absolutely not. It's about making sure that our staff and our students are safe. We have health and safety obligations as employers running large institutions where people gather together in large spaces. So that's the first thing. And we need to ensure that our students, whether they're on campus or not, are able to continue their studies. We need those graduates to continue to come through the pipeline. So I don't think I accept the premise, nor do I accept that the explanation for the shift to online has to do with considerations of cost. In fact, online teaching can often be just as expensive, if not more expensive, than on-campus face-to-face. There are pedagogical considerations. The lecture has been around for over 2,000 years. It's a technology that it might be worth reviewing. There may be better ways of conveying information to a large group of people and focusing face-to-face on other aspects of the learning experience. That's a debate that has no doubt been accelerated and stimulated by COVID. So, Tim, I'm not sure if that answers your question or whether you want to have another go.
Well, look, I think that what I've noticed, particularly at universities which have large numbers of international students who are studying overseas still, and they have got a great deal of their teaching and tutorials and other sessions online still, and it seems to spread over to local students as well, and the campuses are just not as full as they used to be, and these students appear to be missing out on what was a crucial part of their education. And I'm not talking about the older mature age students who often were studying online by preference. I'm talking about those school leavers who are at that formative stage of their life.
Yeah. Look, I can only repeat that I'm not sure I accept the premise. It might be true in some parts of the country, but not in others. But to your point about international students, a lot of those students can't get into the country. Some of them can't leave their home country. So what choice do they have? They either go somewhere else or they continue their study facilitated by online means that every university is now able to provide. There are a lot of students who would love to be here if they could be. They just, for whatever reason, either can't leave their home country or they can't get into this one. Tim, the pandemic is still going. As employers of, as I said, and the operators, if you like, of very big facilities, we have an obligation to ensure that staff and students are safe. Yes, there is a bit of resistance amongst staff to coming back to campus, not surprisingly, but I don't think this is going to be a permanent state of affairs, but we'll see.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Next question, John Ross from Times Higher Education.
Hi, Professor Dewar. Thanks for your presentation. Look, I wanted to ask you about academic freedom. And when Robert French did his review of academic freedom a few years ago, a lot of people in universities came out and said, well, there's no problem with academic freedom, nothing to see here. When I speak to academics, a lot of them have a different view about this, and they're not really worried about so much about the obvious things like a university suing or sacking an outspoken academic, or some firebrand sort of right-winger being banned from speaking at a campus. It's more the insidious stuff, non-disclosure clauses in HR contracts at unis, and probably particularly self-censorship by academics who are worried that if they say something unpopular on certain issues, like particularly around gender and race, that they'll cop a social media pile on or undermine their own careers. And they're bringing these concerns up through organisations like the Heterodox Academy. My sense is I think the general public feels there's something a bit wrong here because they don't hear people in universities offering alternatives to ideas that some people out there in the public find pretty hard to swallow. Do you think universities acknowledge that this whole broad area is part of contributing to the image problem that universities have experienced over the last few years?
So it's not just universities that are saying there isn't a crisis of free speech on campus. Robert French himself said that. But you're right that the focus of his recommendations was around invited speakers on campus and, as you say, actions that employers might take against staff who speak out on certain matters in a way that the university found unpleasant or inappropriate. I think the issue you're referring to, those more insidious constraints on what academics feel they can say, I hear that too, but universities are places that encourage free speech, that encourage debate, and there can be a tendency for orthodoxy to cluster around certain views in certain disciplines, but my observation is that universities are places of robust discussion and debate, and that we should defend that. So it's a complex question you're raising, John, but I think universities remain places where robust debate, exchange of views is still active and tolerated and encouraged indeed.
Thanks.
Next question, Simon Gross from Canberra IQ.
How do you do? Thanks for your speech. Let's talk about mathematics and STEM, how Australia's going backwards and how universities are part of the problem. I quote here from the Australian Centre for Educational Research in May. Over the past decade, roughly 71 to 76% of Year 12 students have been enrolled in one or more maths subjects. That's gone down to 66% in 2020. High-level maths participation even lower, all-time low of 9.2%. And intermediate maths down from 23% to 17% in 2020. Enrolment in high-level maths for girls has dropped from 7.5% in 2019 to 6.7% in 2020. For boys, from 12.9 to 11.9. And this is in the context of a lot of yada-yada campaigns about boosting STEM. Quote from a researcher. The students are basically turning away from mathematics after Year 10. Thinking maths is really hard, it's not really fun. They think they might get a higher ATAR if they choose no mathematics at all, or an easier mathematics subject, she says. Another factor this is her again, another factor that comes into play is universities. They used to require students to have maths as a prerequisite for STEM degrees. That's no longer the case across the board. What the? Universities don't require maths as a prerequisite for STEM? Please explain.
Well, one of the reasons for that is that students were not coming out of school with the required prerequisites.
But they're not doing that. They're gaming the system. They know you've lowered the standards to get in, so they're gaming the system.
It's a chicken and egg.
Yeah.
But what universities saw happening was exactly what you're describing, a decrease in the number of students coming out with the maths prereqs. So what do? They can't just not enrol students in those important disciplines. Often what universities do, if students don't have the formal prerequisites, is provide some sort of bridging program. So universities...
So that lowers the standards in first year?
Not necessarily.
Well, it does, and it draws teachers' efforts away, you know.
These are specially designed transitional programs for students who don't have the formal prerequisites that bring them up to the standard they will need to succeed in those first-year subjects.
And how come it's a cartel? All universities have lowered their standards.
I don't think there is a cartel.
Well, it seems like that. Surely a couple of the stronger universities should say, we're going to keep our standards high. How come?
There is no cartel.
Okay.
Melissa Code, please, from the Mandarin.
Hello, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Well, so you've talked about how universities are now mainstream. You've made a call for more university placements in the future and also a call for more funding for research and development. But you also mentioned micro-credentialing, and I'm really interested to understand what vision you have of the role micro-credentialing universities offer as core business and their purpose and intention.
So I think micro-credentials are already core business of universities, accelerated actually by some of the funding changes made in the Job Ready Graduates package, which gave universities much more flexibility about where to allocate their Commonwealth-supported places. The role it plays is not necessarily as a first experience of tertiary level education, but in order to allow people to change direction, to reskill or acquire a specific skill. Because what we're finding, particularly in industries like IT, is that things move so quickly that university degrees, which take a couple of years to develop, 3 years to deliver, and then another year to review, that by the time you've gone through that 5 or 6 year cycle, things have moved on a long way. So you need a shorter, sharper, more responsive way of dealing with the needs for the working population to reskill, change direction or upskill. So
and is student centricity a part of that delivery, product delivery?
Absolutely, yes.
Tell us how, in the context of
Well, they're often delivered either online or in partnership with an employer. So they're delivered in a way that makes it as easy as possible for the student to complete the qualification and to see the relevance of it to their workplace needs. So a lot of universities are working with employers essentially to deliver in-house training programs, for example, for their employees. So it's a different model from a 3-year degree, but it's becoming an increasingly important one, particularly in disciplines like information technology, where the knowledge and the skills need move very quickly.
Can I just interrupt there? Just on another trend that we've seen, especially over the last couple of years, is the trend towards direct offers. It seems to have gone quite crazy, and the thing is there's no oversight of this, so the admissions centres don't have any oversight of it. They don't even have those students coming through their centres. I don't know if the government collects numbers on what the the offers are being offered in year 11, which is encouraging students not to work terribly hard in year 12 because they've already got a place. I mean, personally, I think there should be a lot more transparency over this, so I would just like your thoughts on it and whether you see it as a good thing. It was seen as a COVID era thing, but I don't see it backing off.
You're right, it was a response that some universities made to the fact that years 11 and 12, or year 11 and 12s, during the COVID era were losing confidence in their capacity to gain an ATAR that would get them into university, and that ran the risk of those students completely disengaging from post-secondary study of any kind. So universities stepped in and were willing to consider making offers on the basis of year 11 results, for example. Now, that's a rigorous process. It's not as if they're letting everyone in, and it is supervised by the tax. And there are differences between the tertiary admission centres over whether it's permitted under the rules. I know this because in Victoria, VTAC doesn't permit that kind of offer, whereas in New South Wales they do. So it was introduced for a sound reason. I think, from what I've heard, I don't have personal experience of it because we're in a different jurisdiction, but from what I've heard, it is done rigorously and it addresses a need.
I mean, I've spoken to the University's Admissions Centre in New South Wales, and they certainly have their own concerns and they don't have oversight of it. And it seems to me that, having spoken to Year 12 leavers, that they accept the offer that comes first. No, not necessarily the course they want to go to most, but the offer that comes first, because that guarantees them a place before they even set their HSC exams. Yeah. Oh well. Next question, Manu Prakash, please, from Pine News, and welcome.
Hi. Thank you so much for a wonderful address, and you covered a breadth of issues. One area in which I wanted to sort of get your insight for was getting a social license and enhancing the social license to operate for universities in the broader community. And like you said, Australia's future is connected to the future of its universities, and you also highlighted how important the largest stakeholders, the community, is. So just wanted to get your insight on how can universities and the sector enhance the social license and get more participation, get more students and input in research for universities. Thank you.
So student participation does depend on the question of places that I think I discussed. As to social license, I think a lot of the things I talked about in the speech are evidence of how hard universities work, particularly to support their communities, to gain or retain or improve that social license. I think universities do a huge amount of that kind of community engagement, making facilities available, providing support and assistance in times of need. It's always a challenge for universities to retain that, but I think the sector has an extraordinary record in that regard. We may need to tell the story a bit more effectively than we have.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Nick Stewart from the Canberra Times.
G'day. I had a fantastic time at university. I used to wake up late. I'd rush to the lectures and then afterwards spend a long time deconstructing all the knowledge I'd absorbed at the Native Rose Hotel. And it was absolutely fantastic. For my children, however, it's a very different experience. They're working because they've got to pay their way through the university. They're also doing degrees that are not the ones that I was doing, where the knowledge was very broad and general. Instead, they're being taught how to actually process, particularly for the first degree, do basic work. I mean, I, for example, could not have become a journalist without a journalism degree, but fortunately, I was earlier on able to do that without a degree. You can't become a nurse without a nursing degree. We've seen a couple of universities, like the ANU at one end, Victoria University at the other, who are separating they're actually learning. Pardon me, learning institutions. They've recognised that the old methods are not ones that are appropriate for the current world. I'm wondering why, when you expect university students to change, to study, to learn, why hasn't the university sector as a whole actually said, look, we're going to have a couple of institutions that are really going to provide the high-level qualifications that we want. There are others that are going to provide the absolutely vital needs and skills that we need provision in Australia. Why isn't the university sector reforming itself in this way?
Well, if I've understood the question correctly, the reason is that the funding and policy settings don't support it. The way we're funded, the incentives that the system creates, encourage a kind of uniformity. We're all trying to do very similar things. There isn't support for specialisation or diversity in the system. All of Australia's universities would fit into one category of the Carnegie classification in the US. In the US, only 25% of their institutions would fit into that classification. That's the PhD awarding institution. So we have much less diversity in the Australian system than, say, in the US, which is a very diverse system. So the answer to your question is that the policy settings don't support or encourage it.
Terrific answer. Should we change the policy settings?
That is a very interesting idea to explore.
Should you be a politician?
UA doesn't have a position on that, I can say that. But there is an advocate for that kind of model sitting in this room. It would be a really interesting model for Australia to think about, that universities did specialise more in certain levels of education or in certain fields of research and teaching, and that way we could have a very different system, but it would be a very interesting conversation.
Can I just interrupt here for a moment? I realise we're coming towards the end and we haven't yet addressed surpluses.
Yes.
And I do think it is, the word on everyone's lips at the moment. So New South Wales, for instance, went from 6 universities in deficit in 2020 to only 1 in 2021. We did see the very famous $1 billion surplus at the University of Sydney, which does have some reasons, some very good reasons for it, but it would still be $700 million without those reasons. How do we justify asking for more money when the surpluses are so huge?
Because one or two outliers do not represent the whole sector.
Everyone's done pretty well.
Okay.
Except for La Trobe.
Well, I don't accept that, okay. Julie. A couple of points. One is that we need to know what we're talking about when we talk about a surplus. Because a lot of the figures that are reported necessarily, by legislation, include one-offs, the things that won't recur. So the top-up of the RBG, the investment returns that people were making if they had large portfolios last year. And you've written about this, Julie, so you know what I'm talking about. But I think there's another factor at work, which is that this is the worst year for all of us. 2022 is the toughest year because we've got fewer students, international students in Australia than we've had since the start of the pandemic. And we could see that coming. We forecast it. So what a lot of universities did was to prepare themselves for what they knew was going to be a very tough 2022 and potentially a very tough 2023. In doing so, they may have generated more surplus revenue over cost, but in preparation for what they knew was going to be a really tough year. I think, and talking to Vice-Chancellorial colleagues yesterday, I think that this year is going to be a really tough year. A lot of Vice-Chancellors forecasting that they will be reporting deficits, and that's what people foresaw and took action to plan for. Okay. But the other thing I'll say is that, well, two other things. One is it's operating result, not net result, that matters. So that's the income relative to expenditure on a recurrent basis. So a lot of what those universities that grabbed the headlines had were those one-offs, and that was included in the figure. It's the operating surplus that's the best measure, and they're very different numbers when you compare them. The other thing is that we're not-for-profit organisations. So when a surplus is made, it gets ploughed back into the organisation to fund the core business.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Tim Shaw from the board, but Maurice Riley is going to ask on his behalf.
Thanks, Julie. Tim's caught in Sydney with some water issues, and all our thoughts with everyone who's tied up in that. This was a short question. What type of targeted measures can your institutions provide to create and grow enrolments in a new Colombo plan 2.0, particularly noting that our Foreign Minister's most recent engagement in the Indo-Pacific region?
I think that's a matter that we'd be very happy to work with government. It's a government programme. They determine its level of funding and the number of students who pass through it. I think collectively the view in the sector is that the new Colombo Plan Mark 1 or Mark 2 has been a huge success. We would absolutely endorse its extension or continuation. But I think that's because it has to be funded by government. It would be a discussion we'd be delighted to have with them.
Okay, thank you very much.
Short question, short answer, beautiful. Our next question is from David Denham from Preview magazine.
Thank you very much. That was very stimulating thinking there. And through it all, although you're a not-for-profit organisation, that dollar really is quite important in all the operations. And I'd just like to dig a little deeper in that, because we had Mark Hutchinson here earlier this year, and he said, well, if you create 16 startups with 23 million, that can be capitalised in a few years to 519 million. And then the government came in and said, oh, this is really good, so we'll cut ARC basic research, and we make sure that it goes through to the cooperation with industry. So we've cut down on the basic research. So this is a difficult thing. Now, the question I have is, you've got from the government another, let us say, $2 billion extra to make up for the starvation of the last 2 years, and you're going to put the thing right. Where would you put? Where do you think are the highest priorities now to improve the tertiary education?
Okay, that's a very big question. So I think you're talking about the university research commercialisation package that the previous government put through, or put partly through, just before the election. I think you do reflect concerns in the sector that while that money was very welcome, and we will absolutely work with government to deliver the outcomes that were sought, that we mustn't forget the basic research. As I said in my speech, that will continue to be vital to Australia's future. And our concern at the moment is that the pendulum has swung a bit too far in the direction of the applied side, potentially at the expense of the basic side.
I like your answer.
Okay. Thank you. And next question, Tim Dodd again, please.
Thank you, Julie. Professor Dewar, and staying on the research theme, the Australian Research Council is one of the major funders of university research. It dispenses about $800 million a year, but it's been in some turmoil lately, not only from interference by ministers of the last government with research decisions, which they had cancelled in some cases, but also the fact that it seems to be a very unwieldy and bureaucratic organisation, that researchers have to spend an immense amount of time making their applications, and the number of applications which get through are getting less and less. Is Universities Australia calling for a full review into the ARC? I've heard some people in the university sector say that they would like to see root and branch reform. Is that your view?
Universities Australia made a submission. Do you remember there was a Senate inquiry into the exercise of the ministerial veto? We made a submission setting out what we believed were the principles that should inform the operation of the ARC. The question of whether there should be a review, I think, is a matter, again, for government. Whatever the decision is made about that, we certainly believe that the core of the ARC should be strong, robust peer review, and if a ministerial veto is to be retained, that it be exercised only with clear criteria and transparency about the reasons for a veto. Our preference would be for there not to be a veto, but if there is to be one, that transparency and robustness of peer review be maintained. I have to say that we have a very high level of confidence in the new management of the ARC. Whether additional steps are needed, I think is a matter that we will continue to discuss with government.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. John Ross.
Hi again, Professor Dewar. I wanted to ask about visa processing and immigration settings. So visa processing is in a bit of a shambles of a state at the moment for all sorts of classes of visas, but students are right in there. We have foreign PhD students who've been waiting close to 3 years to get into the country. And the settings, at the moment, students can work as much as they want to. The potential for skewed behaviour as a result of that is high, I would have thought, and we've seen the results of that in the past. How worried are universities about all this, and how confident are you that this will be addressed under the new government?
It is a concern, and we spoke to the Minister about it yesterday. Universities Australia has spoken to the Department of Home Affairs. The government are very aware of this as a problem, not just for student visas, for visas across the board. But it's vital if we're going to get the international education industry, as it were, back up and running, that we get the visa processing system back up and running. So it is a worry, but the government knows it's a worry, and we believe they're doing everything they can to fix it.
And the work issue, the unlimited work right?
Yeah, so I think we haven't really discussed this in detail, but I think we would advocate for some restoration of limits on the amount of time that students can spend working outside their studies, because we want them to focus on their studies. But that's a conversation we'll also have with government.
Thanks.
Okay, on that note, please thank Professor John Dewar.
Oh, sorry.
And I would like to present you with a gift. What is it? Anyway, guest speaker. You're welcome at any time. We'd love to have you back. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Free drinks at the bar.